Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Plymouth History Department and Plymouth Historical Association talk this evening. This is the annual Christopher Durston Memorial Lecture, which is hosted every year by the History Department in memory of our former colleague, Dr. Christopher Durston. And this year we are delighted to welcome Professor Andrew Hopper from the University of Leicester as our speaker here. And Professor Hopper is a renowned expert in the area of the British Civil Wars, which he has researched, taught and written on extensively. His books that some of you might be familiar with include Black Tom on Sir Thomas Fairfax and the English Revolution, and more recently Turncoats and Renegados on changing sides in the English Civil War. He is currently Principal Investigator on a fascinating new project about Civil War Petitions. And it's on an aspect of this research that he's going to speak to us here this evening with his talk entitled The Human Costs of the British Civil War. If you would like to ask questions during the talk, you can use the Q&A function and we'll put the questions to Professor Hopper at the end, or you can also use the raise your hand function if you'd like to, and we'll take questions from you at the end. So now I'll hand over to Professor Hopper.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Is that coming through fine? Yep, can everyone hear me? Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for welcoming me today for this lecture. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you all and hearing what questions you have at the end. I first remember Chris Durston from, it must have been back in around 1999 or 2000 when he interviewed me for a post at Strawberry Hill in London, on one of my very first interviews, and he was very kind to me. I was unsuccessful, I didn't get the job, but it was a useful, positive experience, and so I have fond, if sadly brief, memories of Chris, and it's a great honour for me to be invited to give this talk, so I'm very glad to be here. So I'd like to talk about the recent project that's been underway since 2017, looking at the maimed soldiers, war widows and orphans of the Civil Wars, the human costs, if you like, of this conflict. And academics have argued for nearly a century about the causes of the Civil Wars. And so this project's really about shifting the focus back to their memory, costs and consequences, and the ways in which those who took part, or those who were affected by the wars, looked back on it afterwards when they were trying to claim welfare for their suffering and their losses during the wars. So the trailblazers of the topic were back in the 1990s, these two gentlemen here, Eric Gruber von Arnie, who'd retired from a position in the British Army in the medical corps, where he was a nurse, a senior nurse, and he wrote a PhD on medical care and nursing during the Civil Wars, which was eventually published as a book. And what really used to annoy Eric was the notion that military nursing and military hospitals only began with Florence Nightingale. And he researched the London, in London, the two principal military hospitals established for the Parliamentarian forces at Savoy and at Ely House. And he went through those hospital records to show that the soldiers there were quite well looked after, and that these much of modern nursing practices, in fact, many of the principles could be traced back to the 17th century, to Parliament's permanent military hospitals. And then this other gentleman here, Geoffrey Hudson, he really trailblazed studying the county pension scheme, which was the means by which pensions and gratuities were offered to maimed soldiers and war widows during and after the Civil Wars. There's kind of been a cleavage in the historiography, in that political historians and Civil War historians hadn't touched this topic, and yet neither had social historians or welfare historians. So we felt that we wanted to do a national subtopic across England and Wales, a comprehensive look at all of the records of the pension scheme, to to really sort of bring these early studies to full fruition. And the idea came to me during a pub lunch with Mark Stoyle, many of you will know, who's an expert on the civil wars in Devon and Cornwall. I was doing some work in the record office in Exeter, and Mark and I went for lunch, and we took the plan to
sorry to
make
interrupt you, Andy. It's just
Yes?
we can't see your slides. You need to hit share to show them up.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I thought.
Sorry, apologies for that, but it was to stop you
Okay.
mid-flow, but it's...
Thank you. Okay. Just looking for the button. Okay. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you, but still can't see the slides.
I can't, okay. Can you see my face?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm back. I was having trouble finding the right screen. Okay, so I've hit share screen. Here we are. Now, hopefully this will now work. Thank you for calling.
Something's starting to work now.
Thank you for calling me back there before I got carried away.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Is that working now?
Yeah, that's now.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so these are our two trailblazers. Eric there looking resplendent at the National Civil War Centre with Fairfax's wheelchair. You'll be able to see some of that, a full picture of that later. And then Jeff Hudson, who's since gone on to work on naval welfare and disability. So Mark, as I was saying, Mark Stoyle and I got together to work out a plan for a funding application to examine these petitions and these pension records in more depth. And we were fortunate, after a couple of years, we were able to submit a proposal, and we were very fortunate to get the funding. And we recruited a team of co-investigators, and much like Cromwell's major generals, we cantonized the kingdom into different regions. So I'm looking at the northern counties. David Appleby's covering the east, Lloyd Bowen looking at Wales and the Marcher counties. Mark Stoyle is covering the south and the southwest. And we have Ismini Pells as our project manager, who really holds the whole thing together and works full time, uploading our material onto our principal output, which is our website, which is a free website. And you can see the URL there on the slide. So anyone can visit that, and you can search for photographs of petitions from wounded soldiers, and you can search for payment records, names and data. And also we're producing a learning website for schools with teachers' workshops that the teachers are helping us design educational materials. And we have a conference volume that will be out hopefully by the end of the year. I'll be writing a monograph on war widows, widowhood and bereavement in the Civil Wars. We have a series of public engagement events with our impact partner, the National Civil War Centre at Newark-on-Trent, at Newark Museum. And we'll also have a series of books published with Taylor and Francis, so that we have a permanent a permanent printed legacy, a hard copy legacy for the project. Because as we all know, websites don't last forever, and when the funding eventually runs out, they have a finite life. So we're hoping that we'll have some permanent legacy things left at the end of the project. So here's the front page of the project. You can search by people, places, payments, events, injuries and ailments, petitions and certificates. For instance, you might want to find out how many maimed soldiers we have in the records with gunshot wounds from Naseby, for example. So quite sophisticated searches are possible. We also have a regular fortnightly blog, a Twitter link, and and the education section for schools. And the University of Nottingham have built the website for us on a WordPress platform. And we're very fortunate to have Graham Turner's illustrations, which are very colourful and really enliven the website somewhat. We're hoping to have this all finished by October 2022. We're uploading counties as we go. I will be talking about some Devon examples tonight for you, but sadly, Devon's a very big county, so it's not up yet. We've not uploaded all the material for Devon. Mark's still working on that. So we have to remember, in making a case for why this study is important, the Civil Wars were a harrowing conflict, a traumatic conflict, but also one which depopulating conflict across the British Isles and Ireland. Now, we're fairly confident that deaths in England and Wales were something like 3% of the population. As you can see, that's more than the First World War and the Second World War combined, if taken as a percentage of population. And of course, deaths in Scotland would have been higher, a higher percentage, and in Ireland, higher still. And we'll never know for certain, but in Ireland, of course, there are all sorts of other factors at play, with migration, with starvation, with displacement of peoples, and so on. So the percentage losses in Ireland would have been pretty horrific, I would imagine, on top. So imagine after the First World War, there was a huge traumatic impact across the rest of the 20th century on the British population. Imagine that magnified in a smaller population in the 17th century, and you begin to see some of its impact. Why study the topic? Well, I mentioned before, trying to bring together social and political histories of the Civil Wars to try and bridge that divide, but also to try and widen the remit of military history away from the sort of armchair commanders and the study of strategy and tactics and so forth. We'd like to argue that the treatment of the dead, the treatment of the wounded, the treatment of soldiers' families all mattered, and they mattered at the time, and they are relevant for military study. And this has been called into question by some historians. We'd like to argue that they are relevant and important things for military history to engage with. And a book that I admire very much, This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, does that very well for the American Civil War, looking at that sort of traumatic impact on the population and looking at mourning practices and bereavement and so on. There's not anything quite like that yet, I don't think, for the British or Irish Civil Wars. And so this project will hopefully begin to address that. Many of the wounded returned to active service. They did remain militarily important. Widows and wounded soldiers remained relevant to both sides' war efforts. War widows would write to commanders, trying to, in some cases, trying even to dictate strategy, trying to encourage prisoner exchanges, these kinds of things. Perceived ill treatment of captives, for instance, or other war victims might spark wars in propaganda, in paper wars, and the pamphlets that were printed by both sides. The evidence of the pensions too also gives us critical evidence about the recruitment of the rank and file and their patterns of mobilisation across the country. So we're going to plot in each county on parish maps in each county, plot where the recipients of military welfare lived, where were their home parishes. And then what can we tell from that about the patterns of mobilisation for both sides' war efforts? Huge efforts were made to relieve the wounded and widowed, as we'll see. Charles Carlton has dismissed the pension scheme as inefficient and parsimonious. And indeed, even generous pensions did not provide a full livelihood for people. Quite often, they would only provide a fraction, maybe a quarter of the livelihood that a person needed. So you can see why he might argue that they were parsimonious and didn't make much impact. Yet we'll see that they increased tax burdens significantly at a time when tax had rocketed anyway to pay for the rival sides' war efforts, and the country was exhausted from huge taxation. So that they raised, the fact that they were managed to raise anything at all, I think, is quite some achievement, especially when it's considered that we're talking probably about a 5-figure sum here, over £100,000 raised in the course of the lifetime of the county pension scheme. And then the politics behind this relief effort are worthy of interest and study too, because of course the Long Parliament weren't about to reward royalist widows or soldiers with pensions, and neither was the restored monarchy of Charles II when it returned. They weren't about to reward parliamentarians, their former enemies. They weren't about to reward their maimed soldiers or war widows too. So you only qualified for relief if you were on the winning side, and that depended on what point of history you were at, whether you're in the 1640s and 50s or in the 1660s and thereafter. And this made healing and settling after the Civil Wars more difficult, as we'll see, and we'll come back to that theme as we move through. So here's the pension scheme, the legislation behind it, just outlined for you. It went back to the Elizabethan Act of 1601, so it was building on existing legislation. But the day after Edge Hill, Parliament made this rather rash promise that they would, perhaps thinking that the war would be over by Christmas, made this promise that not only would their maimed soldiers be looked after with welfare, but also the widows and children of their fallen comrades, all those who had engaged for Parliament. And this was new. This was an extension of the Elizabethan scheme. And in May 1647, it was extended further, and a county rate was settled on every parish, and the sums would be raised by constables collecting the money. The constables would then take their sum to the High Constable of the 100. The High Constables would then pay these sums in to the county treasurer. And when the Quarter Sessions met, of course, 4 times per year in different parts of the county, the Justices of the Peace would then dish out the pensions depending on how much money they had in the treasurer's pot. But of course, this was only for parliamentarian servicemen. Royalists would have had to rely on poor relief or local parish charity to get by. They wouldn't have been able to apply for a county pension unless somehow they were able to disguise the fact that they'd been royalists. That might have been difficult for them. Then in 1662, after the return of Charles II, this was reversed so that parliamentarians were thrown off the pension scheme and replaced by their royalist counterparts. And in many parishes, this was done through local denunciations. So people would come forward and say, I know John Smith, he fought for the enemy, I should have his pension. And that's how it worked. Informers will come forth and claim a pension by pointing out that one of the current pensioners was no longer eligible to receive it. So this, of course, was going to lead to a lot of settling of scores and ill feeling locally. And also, the 1662 Act stipulated that payments would only henceforth be made to those who had always been loyal. So this ruled out anyone who changed sides, of which there were thousands during the Civil Wars. So you had not only to have been a royalist, but you had to have always been a royalist. But it wasn't just county justices at the Quarter Sessions that could be approached for military welfare. We're finding all sorts of authorities were approached in these years. Borough courts, mayors and aldermen in towns, the county committees that the Long Parliament settled out in the localities that for a time sometimes replaced Quarter Sessions. The committees at Westminster, the Committee for Maimed Soldiers, the Committee for Compounding or Advance of Money. You could petition there if you had the money and wherewithal and means to attend London. You could ask for welfare there, although of course that would be more likely only the officers and the officers' widows that would be able to afford to travel and maintain themselves in London for long enough. Likewise, the parliamentarian Lord Generals, Essex, Fairfax, and Cromwell. Fairfax's headquarters from December 1646 was bombarded with war widows and wounded officers and refugees from Ireland too, petitioning and claiming money at army headquarters every day. Military governors such as Edward Massey at Gloucester, for example, he endorsed many pensions and gratuities paid out to his wounded soldiers within the city of Gloucester in his local forces. Sometimes people petitioned the Republican Council of State or Oliver Cromwell himself, and then after the Restoration, Royalist claimants could petition the House of Lords, the Privy Council, or even Charles II himself. And there's quite a number of those that survive in State Papers 29, often from Royalist officers and often from the widows of Royalist officers, many of whom were out to settle scores and claim not only recognition and recompense, but also a measure of vengeance against people who'd had a hand in their husband's deaths. So here's the initial work that Mark did back in the 1990s on the pension records, just mapping out where the bulk of royalist and parliamentarian pensioners were located. You may remember that in his book, Loyalty and Locality. And of course, he showed how they came from different parts of Devon. There was parliamentarian strength in North Devon and of course around Plymouth. And Exeter too, and parts of South Devon. And as we can see from this map, the Royalists are clumped very much in the middle of the county, in those central parishes. And as I'm sure many of you will know, the war in Devon was a series of, it was really a sort of ebb and flow as the tide went back and forth, as different sides fought for control of the county. There were a lot of garrisons. There was a lot of internecine, intermittent garrison warfare, raiding, plundering, a lot of assaults on fortified positions, lots of sieges. It's sieges and assaults that were the characteristic engagement of the civil wars rather than the big set-piece battle. But you can see Devon had a very busy civil war, as I'm sure you're all aware, and not least the 6 sieges of Plymouth. I don't think I can think of a town besieged as many times during the civil wars as Plymouth was, certainly not within England. So here's how one of our first maps looks like. Here's the North Riding of Yorkshire, and this is the plotting of petitioners. So the thicker, the wider the circle, the larger the number. You'll see that the biggest numbers are around Helmsley. Royalists, lots of Royalists in Helmsley. There was a garrison, a big Royalist garrison in Helmsley Castle, so that helps explain that. And you'll see the North York Moors off to the right is very sparse, and the Pennines off to the left, also very sparse, and the vast number of soldiers on both sides are down that central belt of the county. And that's the route of invasion that the Royalist army of the Earl of Newcastle took when they came south into Yorkshire in December 1642 on their march down to York. It's pretty much sort of along the Great North Road, and it's along the lowland, the lowland part of the county, and probably the more heavily settled part of the county. So here we get into the debate about what these kinds of maps show. Do they show population density? Do they really show allegiance? Or do they show poverty? These are people coming forth, claiming for welfare payments. So there's all sorts of things these maps might show, and we have to be careful how we interpret them for each county. So here's our material for Devon. There's 274 petitions and certificates that survive. which is terrific. That's a really rich county collection. I think that's only Lancashire, Cheshire and Denbighshire I can think of with more numbers than Devon's. So Devon is a super collection. As you can see, it tells us there are a lot more about the royalists than the parliamentarians, large numbers of royalist petitioners. It also shows that there were very few royalist widows compared to soldiers petitioning after 1660. And my inkling from other counties, certainly from looking at Yorkshire, is that royalist war widows were more likely to be given pensions or gratuities if they were officers' widows. Royalist justices of the peace seem to have a problem with allowing, with showing that rank and file war widows were entitled to state pensions and state relief. They seem to have a problem with that in a way that the parliamentarian justices before perhaps didn't. But we'll see when we've finished all the counties, we'll see whether see how far that hypothesis holds true. And we can see that there are 5 order books as well that survived from 1640 to 1685, which detail the payments awarded to the claimants. So we can cross-check the petitions. Sometimes the petitions have an endorsement on the bottom saying how much they were awarded. Otherwise, we can check in the order books to see how many times they were able to claim and how much money was awarded to them. There was a group petition as well that's worthy of note from Plymouth in 1649, where 32 parliamentarian war widows banded together to launch a joint petition to the justices and were each given a one-off payment, a gratuity of £1 each. So on top of the Civil War pension material, we have to remember that Devon was a maritime county. And of course, this is really important in the Civil War because the parliamentarian garrison held out in Plymouth for so long because they were supplied by sea, and the parliamentarians enjoyed a naval advantage. But we can see in the Exeter, in the record office there, we can see lots of petitions too relating to the Dutch wars, the 1660s and the 1670s. There are petitions too relating to the ransom and release of captives in North Africa from the Barbary corsairs. And there are even petitions relating to the Tangier garrison of the 1660s. So I'm sure lots more work could be done on those collections too. Here's an example of one of the Devon petitions. You'll see that it's a petition of Julian Vildew of Wimpole, a war widow, and she relates the sorry tale that her husband and her son had volunteered to serve in Ireland, and there's a little insertion in the manuscript saying in the Parliament service, make it very clear, make it very clear to the justices that she qualified for relief, and saying that her husband had been slain and that this left her aged and decrepit, with nothing left, unable to get her maintenance by reason of her age and the failings of her sight. And sometimes widows' petitions would say how many small children they had who were helpless and needy. They were never big strapping lads who could help out on the farm. It was always their vulnerability and smallness that would be emphasised in petitions. And we note here at the bottom the endorsements of Julian Vildew's local neighbours and community, headed by the minister, the church wardens and constables. You see their names and marks signed off in support of her petition below. And of course, they had a vested interest in her success, because if they could shunt her off parish relief, off poor relief, and onto a county pension, then they would have to pay less for her upkeep. We can sense something too of the problem of the authorial voice as well with these documents, because many of the petitioners would have been illiterate, and even those that weren't would probably have gone to a professional scribe and had a petition drawn up by someone with some rudimentary legal training. That might be a paid clerk, might even be their church warden or the minister of their parish. And so quite often the opening of the salute to the magistrates at the beginning of a petition could be quite formulaic. And then towards the end, they could also be quite formulaic, where they prayed for the magistrates' longevity and happiness and prosperity. And there's usually quite a grovelling and submissive tone at the end of the petition. So we can see that the wording and the vocabulary in the petition would have been shaped by the amanuensis, or the scribe, who was writing them for the maimed soldier or the war widow. But very often, the bit in the middle, the bit where they explain why they were deserving of relief, that would have been their own recollections, their own memories of the civil wars and the ways in which they had suffered. And they would have to stand in court and own these details as true. So they couldn't become too fanciful or depart too much from the known truths. Now, for war widows, this would have been very, many of them faced a great deal of problems and trouble in putting forward a petition. First of all, they would need some kind of proof of evidence that their husbands had died. If their husbands were serving in Scotland or Ireland, this could be very uncertain and could take years for them to find out. And in the meantime, they would somehow have to get by. They'd also need certificates, certificates from the officers of the company or troop that their husband died. Maimed soldiers would need certificates that their injuries had been inflicted on active service. And they might need a certificate from their officer or from the surgeon who'd worked or performed the operation or treatments on them. And quite often, maimed soldiers would have their wounds inspected at the quarter sessions to show that they were deserving of relief. But there may have been an element of discomfort and shame and embarrassment for them in having to be lined up in this way in public to show in what ways they were disabled from earning a living in order to qualify for a pension. In some counties, widows would only be relieved after all the maimed soldiers had first been dealt with. So in some counties, widows have lower mean pensions than soldiers, but not everywhere. In some counties, there are cases like the North Riding of Yorkshire, where parliamentarian war widows, on average, are given more generous pensions than maimed soldiers. So it doesn't always hold true. And of course, the figure of the woman ravished by war, the theme of female suffering, could be turned to propaganda purposes by both sides. I have an example of a piece of parliamentarian propaganda here, soon after the Royalists' capture of Exeter in 1643, which portrays Devonshire as a ruined woman pleading for pity and mercy, with her hair unravelled and unkempt, savaged by Royalist brutality. And this tract narrated how Cavaliers had had stripped civilians and herded them naked into a pond, which has very strong overtones with what is mentioned in some of the depositions against the Irish rebels in 1641. Probably a very conscious link in linking that story to Ireland in this piece of parliamentarian propaganda. And I would recommend to you the 1641 Depositions Project and its website, because it was very much an inspiration for us to do our project on Civil War petitions. And there are some ways in which the petitions and the depositions can be compared. And there's a PhD student at Leicester, Aresta Makuta, who is doing just that, looking at narratives of suffering in the deposition, comparing them with the petitions in England and Wales. And of course, I hinted that after 1660, one had to be careful about how one petitioned, about how one presented one's service, because one had to have always been loyal in order to qualify. And we have an example here of how a local royalist war widow was able to convince the justices and able to claim a pension with her petition saying that her husband was a loyal subject to the late martyred Charles I's most glorious memory. We see that formulation in a lot of royalist petitions, pandering to the royalist JP's memory of the Civil War. And that in a fight called Haltnersday's fight, was taken prisoner and carried into the town of Plymouth, and there unjustly and inhumanly hanged for his loyalty. Grace goes on to narrate that she'd lost her estate, she'd been plundered by the parliamentarians, and now she had no means to settle those scores because of Charles II's act of oblivion having prevented her from doing that. So she petitioned for a pension instead. The problem was her husband had been a parliamentarian, and that was the reason he'd been hanged. He'd been recaptured by his former comrades, who treated him as a deserter, as an apostate, as a side changer or a turncoat, and he'd been hanged. And that was the reason he'd been hanged. So, but Grace couldn't say that in her petition, of course, because it would have disqualified her from receiving a pension. And she was wanting to celebrate her husband's royalism and stress his constant loyalty in order to qualify for that. We can get a lot of information from some of the petitions too about the wounds themselves and how they were treated. So here's an example from Devon, Richard Thomas of Ashcombe. It's not a Civil War example, it's from just before the Civil Wars in the 1620s. He narrated how he had been grievously wounded at the Ile de Ré by a bullet in the head, which went into his mouth and came out at the hinder part of his head, tearing and shattering all his teeth and jawbone, so as that he hath not been able to eat his bread, nor any solid meat ever since, but has been fain to live upon broths and liquid meats, by reason whereof he is grown imbecile and weak in body, in this his old age, 82 years. He was granted a pension of £2 per annum as late as 1677. Nearly 50 years after his injury. And so we can see there are plenty of more examples like this of soldiers suffering horrific injuries and living on for decades afterwards, living on in dreadful pain, one imagines, from carrying wounds of this nature. There are many amputees, there are many blinded soldiers. Here's an example here of a Scots officer, William Forbes, whose face was mangled after he was knocked down by the wind from a cannonball at the siege of Pontefract Castle. He was stood next to Sir Thomas Fairfax at the time, and when they both stood up, half of Forbes's face was missing. He was nicknamed thereafter Blowface Forbes and survived for another 18 months before being killed fighting the Royalists in Scotland. So all this really begs the question, if soldiers were able to survive as horrific wounds as these, were the medical practitioners of the day quite as useless as we might be led to think? We can compare the treatments mentioned in the petitions with the books and manuals printed and published by the professionals themselves. Richard Wiseman is a famous royalist example. His parliamentarian counterpart is very much James Cook, surgeon at Warwick Castle for the parliamentarians, who published this book, Marrow of Surgery, which had details of operations he performed on parliamentarian soldiers during the war years. And our project manager, Ismini Pels, has argued quite forcefully in this article in Historical Journal that the petitions evidence show that perhaps medical practitioners weren't quite so hopeless as we might think. They may not have had anaesthetics, they may have not have had antiseptics, but surgeons like Wiseman and Cook learnt a great deal from observation and practice and saved a great many lives. And we know this because we have all these petitions from these soldiers decades later who are still living with these wounds. Some, wounds including gunshot wounds, some even to the torso, they've survived, that one wouldn't imagine them having been able to survive. We can look too at the social elite, and there's no better example here than Sir Thomas Fairfax, who's wounded at least 4 times during the Civil Wars, and whose wheelchair, as I mentioned, is on display at the National Civil War Centre in Nottinghamshire, thanks to the kindness of Tom Fairfax, the cousin of the current Lord Fairfax, who lent this and many other Fairfax artefacts to the museum. Fairfax took a sword cut to the face at Marston Moor. He was actually shot through the wrist at Selby. That's not, the slide's not correct there. He was shot through the wrist. He took a bullet to the neck and shoulder area at the siege of Helmsley, and he was struck on the head at Wetherby in only his 2nd engagement in 1642. And after the wars, other ailments piled up: rheumatism, the stone and gout, and fevers he'd caught in the Low Countries as a youth. And he was pretty, even at the age of 50, he was using this wheelchair. And these wounds gave him a certain capital in the parliamentary cause, in that they demonstrated his suffering in the cause, as well as his military reputation to showing such success for the parliamentary cause. And in the Protectorate Parliament in 1659, Sir Arthur Hazelridge was making a point that the Parliament needed to pay and look after the soldiery better. And he was sat next to Fairfax at the time, and he stood up and he said, "I bless God that he, having received so many wounds, now sits at my right hand." So an example there of the discussion of wounds and the cultural capital of wounds being brought up in the Protectorate Parliament. The most richly recompensed war widow of the Civil Wars was Catherine Greville, Lady Brooke, in Warwick Castle. Here we see her painted in mourning attire shortly after the death of her husband, shot dead at the siege of Lichfield Cathedral Close in 1643. She was pregnant with her 5th son, Fulk, at the time he was shot, and Parliament soon voted her £5,000 in Irish lands. And her account books survive in the Warwick Record Office that show that that was paid in full, for every last farthing. By about 1651, that money had been paid in full. And I've not found a war widow anywhere paid quite anything like that amount yet. Do let me know if you know of any examples. And then there's another example of Charles II's generosity and what that meant for the ratepayers of Yorkshire, with the case of Grace Portington, widowed in 1660, when her husband, the Royalist colonel, was released after 12 years of imprisonment in Hull. Reunited with his pet monkey, it bit him and he died of gangrene at home soon afterwards. But the ratepayers of the West Riding were not laughing at this, because the king ordered Grace to receive a pension of £20 per annum. This was a huge sum. Most pensions would be £2 or £3 per annum. Officers' pensions may be as much as 8 or even 10. But to give a war widow £20 per annum, this was a big statement, because she was gentry, she was a colonel's widow. It would reflect very badly on the Royalists if she was not properly looked after. And she claimed this for 15 years, in total £300. The rest of the Royalist war widows after 1660, in the rest of the West Riding, had to make do with about £5 between all of them during that same period. So that gives you an idea about how Grace Portington monopolised the county treasurers of the West Riding for 15 years. So I'd like to conclude now, and thank you for your patience in listening to me for so long. I think our project will help show how the consequences of civil war went on for many generations afterwards. We have petitions as late as 1718. So, you know, that's a long time after the civil wars. I have an inkling that the parliamentarian pensions tended to be slightly more generous, especially for war widows of the rank and file. And this was a landmark moment for these individuals because they were given the right to petition for a pension. They were entitled to state relief and therefore a part of the political nation perhaps for the first time, even if this door was rather slammed shut on them in the 1660s, when royalist war widows are usually sent away with one-off gratuities, told never to come back and never to claim again. Judging from the numbers of survivors and pensioners who did return active service, we might conclude that medical care, hospitals, surgery, and nursing wasn't quite so hopeless as we might imagine in our modern age. Perhaps we shouldn't be too condescending looking back on medical practitioners of the 17th century, and also how the treatment of the wounded shaped military strategy in many occasions, and also the propaganda of both sides. But above all, I think dispensing and withholding of welfare to reward and to punish meant that wartime memories mattered for a long time thereafter, making healing and settling much more difficult. And then we'd like to hope and conclude that our project has a great deal of modern day resonance to us. What can the experiences of the civil wars teach us about the origins of military welfare? What can they teach to us about the provision of that to our armed services personnel and their families today? What would justices of the peace in the 17th century make of the Armed Forces Covenant? Would they recognise the principles behind it? Would they consider modern welfare sufficient for our armed services today? And we've explored this theme recently in a 30-minute film that you can see on our website in the at the address there on the slide, representing disability in Shakespeare's world. We collaborated with the Royal Shakespeare Company to dramatise some of the petitions from the Civil War period, but also from the period of James I as well, from the period of Shakespeare's own time, to dramatise these petitions and to intersperse them with extracts from what Shakespeare had to say on the matter in plays like Henry V, for example. And so we very much hope that you'd like to take a look at that film at some point. And I'll leave you on that note. I'll conclude the talk here and thank you very much for listening. I look forward to some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hopper. I think that was fascinating. And I think, like most of the audience, I think we can't wait to see all of the petitions up. And I'm sure many of us will be tucking into the Devon collection in particular. I have a strong interest there myself. So if anybody'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise the hand function and I'll be able to come to you. But we also have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And the first I'm going to go to is from my colleague, Dr. James Gregory. I'm actually going to ask James to ask his question out himself because it's rather long. So rather than me interpreting the question to you, I'll let James ask it himself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, James.
Oh, It was a brilliant paper, and I'm really interested in the database. So I was fully listening to you, but also exploring the database for the first time. And what I was struck by was the seal that you showed us, which said justice for the main soldier. Then I typed in all of the language of entreaty and petition, mercy and clemency. What work's being done on the language of justice compared with mercy and compassion through these petitions?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point and a very good question. Most of the petitions are quite deferential, but we do have some which are quite forceful. And some, we've noticed war widows in particular can sometimes be more forceful. Sometimes they can even cite scripture and law to the justices or to the individuals they're petitioning. And they can play upon their religious attitudes and viewpoints and expectations. There was a very clever petition submitted to Cromwell himself in 1655, I think, by Jane Meldrum, the widow of Colonel John Meldrum, a parliamentarian killed at Cheriton, which really played upon Cromwell's belief in the second coming of Christ and the day of judgment, saying that she had no doubt that Cromwell in his good Christian wisdom would relieve her, so that Christ, he would and that Christ would put it to his reckoning on the last day. Is how she finishes the petition. So, and she was successful, and she was given money to. She may even have been given £100, quite a large sum of money. So I think some petitioners were smart and were able to gear their petition towards the authority they were addressing. But yeah, striking that balance between deference and entitlement was quite difficult and quite a careful thing. Yeah. And quite often it was much easier and more advisable to emphasize one's helplessness, one's vulnerability, and one's utter dependence upon the justices.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. I'll give a couple of quick questions from the Q&A, and then I'll go to a longer question live. So one question is, how much research has been done on Cornwall yet?
I'm afraid the collection for Cornwall is very small, and there's not very much there. Mark Stoyle is doing Cornwall. That's one of his counties, and we haven't uploaded that yet. If you had any inquiries about Cornwall in particular, it'd probably be best to email Mark. He's at Southampton University. Okay. But it will be there by October 2022.
Oh, it's good to know there is something for Cornwall. So I'll come to a question from Stephen Luscombe. So I'll ask Stephen if he'd like to ask the question himself, or would you prefer me to read it out for you?
No, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry, it's like a multiple question in a way, because one leads on to the other. But first of all, who was responsible for keeping the service or the pay records of the individual regiments during the war? Was it down to the individual colonels who raised the regiments, or was there some other form of record keeping? And then maybe if you answer that first, then maybe I can go on.
Yeah, well, we know a lot less about the Royalists, I'm afraid, because as the Royalists surrendered, a lot of their records often went up in smoke, so that they would burn them tactfully so that people weren't people weren't held accountable after. We know much more about the parliamentarian pay records. They survive in the State Papers, in the State Papers 28 and the Commonwealth Exchequer Papers. And they're kept by the regiments, yeah.
Okay.
And we can find out a lot about the arrears of pay owed to soldiers by looking at the certificates for the sale of Crown land, because soldiers were issued with debentures for their pay after they were disbanded. And quite often those debentures were redeemable against purchases of Crown land. And so often rank and file soldiers would have to sell their debentures at a fraction of their value to an officer or a speculator, who would then use those debentures, those pay records, if you like, of owed pay, arrears of pay, to redeem those against Crown estates. So there's a lot of material about the parliamentarian pay records in the National Archives, both in the certificates for the sale of Crown lands and in the Commonwealth Exchequer papers.
Okay, that kind of goes a little bit to explaining sort of like the second part of the question, but I was wondering if you can confirm then that perhaps this would explain why the Royalists were more likely to reward senior officers, as those records would have been more widely known, as to, you know, who was commanding the regiments would have been very well known, and why they may have been more reluctant to give it to lower ranks who couldn't prove that they had serviced on behalf of the Royalists. Well,
some Royalist officers, of course, would intercede for their former soldiers. So Bartholomew Gidley in Devon is an example that Mark Stoyle's writing up, who actually endorsed and signed a lot of petitions from Royalist rank and file maimed soldier claimants. So I think that the Royalist officers were keen to help their rank and file when they could. And I think that one of the big questions of this project is, you know, what did all those Royalist wounded soldiers, how did they get by in the 1650s with no pensions? And we'll say, well, parish charity, yes, perhaps economy of makeshifts, helped from their neighbours and friends, but also doing things like presenting themselves at gentlemen's gates at Christmas time. And there are examples of that, of Royalist soldiers on anniversaries or at Christmas, going to receive hospitality or alms from Royalist gentry, or in some instances possibly even their former officers too. So I think maybe the Royalists, you know, had a role in relieving their rank and file too, in that sense.
I'll take another question from the Q&A, and then I'll go to somebody who has their hand raised. So this is from F. Lane, and it's thanks for a fascinating talk. Is there any evidence of fraudulent petitions being made besides those that embellished the truth?
Okay, yes, that's a good question. We often get questions about fraud. There are a handful of examples of petitioners claiming in multiple counties successfully, and then getting found out and forced to return sums that they shouldn't have been claiming. So that there was that means of claiming fraudulently, claiming in multiple places. You were supposed to claim in the parish where you'd been recruited, or the parish of your birth. And they might not necessarily always be the same. And so sometimes there are tugs of war, if you like, between rival jurisdictions, particularly if they're in different counties, where claimants are sent back and forth. The West Riding will say, no, this is a North Riding pensioner, it's for the justices over there to decide. And claimants are sent back and forth. But there are a handful of fraudulent claims. But more often there's denunciations for people. So there are examples of Royalists being outed as Royalists in the late 1640s and 1650s, where people have come forward and said they fought for the enemy, they shouldn't be receiving this pension, and getting them ousted from the list, and then quite often claiming their pension themselves. That sort of incentivizing of ratting on your neighbour to claim their pension.
Okay. Thanks. I'll go to Barry, who's got a hand up in the participant section, and we'll take that question now. There we go. Oh, right, it's being slow to unmute here.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, it was my wife Anne's question. It was a question about Baltimore.
Yes, fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed it, because often they changed their sides in Devon when they came to like Totnes. But the treaty that ended the Civil War was signed at Baltimore and Exeter, and I think the last battle was fought in North Devon. And are there any records from that?
Yeah, the last one of the last big battles was at Torrington in North Devon. I expect that will feature in some of the Devon petitions, yes, and they'll be uploaded onto the website as soon as Mark's able to transcribe those, and we'll get those available as soon as we can. But yes, I expect that there will be examples from time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We have a question from Jameson Tucker now. There we go.
Aha. So my question, I suppose, is about the afterlives of these payments and the ways in which the payments themselves become historical facts, or at least mementos that can be waved about to prove one's dedication to the cause in the years back. This is something I'm more familiar with in the US Civil Wars or similar, but the fact that one received a pension is itself eventually becomes a marker. So having petitioned for a pension, eventually you use the pension to petition for something else, or just generally, well, I guess the Chelsea pensioners are a sort of example. Do we see much of that here?
I think receiving a pension, as you say, was a kind of a vindication of one's worthiness in the community, and less shameful than having to take poor relief. And so you can see why people would want to get that pension, to get that vindication in front of their neighbours. I think this was particularly important, I think, for royalist gentry who may have feared slipping from that status and may have feared that loss of face and loss of dignity and respect in their neighbourhoods if they were seen to be having to actually work, or if they were seen to being unable to maintain their previous lifestyle and dignity in the parish. And so you can see why often gentry, pensions awarded to gentry and their widows were a lot higher for that purpose, because the royalists didn't want to see those people suffering and their enemies going around gloating at their discomfort and their misfortune. So there was a sense, and that was true to an extent of the parliamentarians too. There was a fear of loss of status amongst the middling sorts and the better off. And a pension could be a good way of shoring that up, not only in the financial recompense it would bring, but also in bolstering one's standing reputation in the parish. But yeah, that's a really good question. I'm very interested in any comparisons with the American Civil War. I know that there's a huge amount of pension records in the National Archives in Washington, DC. There's been a big digitization project on those. So yes, I'm very interested in any American comparisons with this.
Thank you.
It's not so much a question as more a comment from somebody. They were wondering if you could share the link to the Shakespeare and Disability film. So we can maybe type that up and we can share that with people. And the talk will be available on the university's YouTube channel. So you will be able to see it in there. So we'll make sure to get that to anybody who's interested in it. We have a question from Michael Waringa. So I'll allow Michael to talk here. There we go.
Thank you, Andrew. Really fascinating talk. I was just thinking about how it moved on from the legislation of 1601, where the parishes were made to pay. And was there any resistance to that? Obviously, due to the nature of the payments.
Yes, that's a good question. Quite a lot of the time, parishes would fail to raise as much money as they were expected to. That may have been from hostility, but it may also have been from exhaustion and from poverty. The wars had a hugely, had a huge financial impact. And so often pensions might run in arrears. Treasurers would constantly being hounded by the justices to chase up high constables, to have their accounts audited, to audit the constables' accounts. It was a real struggle to raise this money. And so, we tend to think about how it's dished out and who are the worthiest recipients of relief and so on. But yeah, there's a whole other story of how the money was raised in the first place. There could quite often be arguments between parishes over who had been rated too highly and who hadn't paid enough. And so it was a real struggle to raise this, yeah. And sometimes there wasn't enough in the pot to meet to meet the expenditure, and the justices had to try and find money from elsewhere, or it's quite often people just went without. And quite often parish officers would be, would be threatened and held accountable by the justices for failing to perform these duties. So it was a real struggle to administer.
Yes, so I think Barry has a really interesting question here.
Yes, because I'm a psychologist. Were there any pensions for mental afflictions?
Yes, there's scholars like Ismene Pels and Erin Peters are looking closely at the language in some of these petitions, and we can look at 17th century vocabulary for people who were inflicted, who got mental suffering as a result. And there are cases where sort of 17th century forerunners of PTSD, for example, can be detected in some pensions, talking about their afflictions, their melancholies. There's an example of a royalist officer in Yorkshire who goes walkabout at night, and his wife can no longer care for him, appeals to the justices that she can't cope. So there are all sorts of hints and suggestions. I wouldn't say there's a huge amount, but there are examples that can be read carefully and sensitively. And there's publications that are beginning to be published on this topic. Watch out for Erin Peters and Ismene Pels, who are both writing on this.
Okay. James Gregory has another question there that quite interests me as well, as I'm sure you'll see when he asks it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. So you mentioned the maritime aspects, and I was aware with the seal and everything it was talking about maimed soldiers. What can you tell us about maimed sailors and efforts to support them?
Well, that would be a great new project, wouldn't it? And you'd be looking at the Admiralty records. I'm sure Elaine knows more about these than me. But I mean, that would be another wonderful way to extend the project, wouldn't it? And to look at maritime records too. By and large, we haven't done that with this. We've had to try to make it achievable within the 4 years. So I'm afraid to say that it's an open slate there. I don't know very much about naval welfare yet, but I'd like to, and I'd be willing to talk to people about that in the future.
Yes, I can chip in on that one. Actually, the Chatham Chest records provide details of naval pensions through the war, so there's naval injuries, so that they're a very rich source of records that survive from most, but not all, of the Civil War. So that's kind of where the injured sailors are by and large going in this period. So we've
another funding application there, Elaine. That's what we'll have to.
Oh, they'll be queuing up. But we've a quick question here, and then I'll take one from Alan. So the quick question is, do you know when the last pension request related to the Civil War was made?
The last one I've seen is 1718, and it's in Buckinghamshire, and it's a chap called John Lever, who is the son of William Lever, a blind pin maker from Aylesbury, who petitions the justices for recompense for him having paid for his father's funeral. His father was the pensioner who died sometime between January and April 1718, and the justices award him, I think it's 20 shillings, something like that, to pay for his father's funeral as the last maimed soldier, the last cavalier, if you like. That's the last one I know of in England. So each county is different. Each county has differing records surviving. The West Riding of Yorkshire, for example, has a lot after 1700, amazingly enough. There are at least 20 or so royalist maimed soldiers after 1700 there, and many of them in adjoining parishes, which is really interesting. The last one in Northumberland, I think, is 1710. But they're incomplete records. We don't have perfect records for every county. But as you can see, that's a long time afterwards that the relief is still being claimed. The pensions, the formal pension scheme under the 1662 Act was wound up in 1679, but people claim beyond that on the basis of the Elizabethan Act. And quite often, justices would instruct churchwardens to relieve the claimants rather than them receiving county pensions. They'd merely order their parish officers to give them weekly payments instead.
Okay. We have a question now from Alan. There we go.
Hello. Did inflation kick in at any point, and did it affect the awards given? Inflation.
I've no sense of that yet. No, I've no sense of that yet. It's an interesting question. It's not something I've considered, actually. So I'll note that down for future reference and thought. But not really noticed that, really. There's no sense of the pensions getting more as time goes on. But once we have the full data, we'll be able to plot some graphs and see in more detail.
Well, as there are no more questions in the Q&A for the moment, I'm going to abuse Chair's privilege to ask a question, if I may. So if anybody else wants a question, just please raise your hand or pop it into the Q&A. So obviously you said Devon's a very rich county and Cornwall isn't as rich. In terms of the scale, what other counties are on the smaller scale? And is there any sort of trend in terms of where they are? Or is it just random, or is it the periphery that's smaller? I'm just curious to get in.
I think it's fairly random, Elaine. Bedfordshire and Berkshire have virtually nothing. Cumberland has one petition. Some counties just have a handful of petitions, but really full order books. So Warwickshire has one petition, but hundreds of claimants in the order books. So there you've got, you can see that there's a big pension scheme in operation, but somehow the petitions have been lost or haven't survived. So each county is different in some way. Bigger counties, the West Riding has about 100 petitions. And that has over 1,000 claimants, and there's lots and lots of claimants. Lancashire's a very big collection, over 300 petitions there. So it varies. There's counties like Northamptonshire and Essex, which have sort of middling amounts, Nottinghamshire and Staffordshire, sort of middling amounts of petitions and order books. But they're all different, and they really range from having absolutely nothing to absolutely tons. I think Denbighshire is the biggest collection, which we weren't expecting. There may, in fact, be more Welsh petitions on the website now than English ones, on account of the enormous size of Denbighshire and Lloyd Bowen's diligence in getting Denbighshire done first.
Well, we have a question now from, oh, sorry, I've hit the wrong person there, excuse me. This is the problem. We have a question from Emma.
Yes. Was there a guideline given to the parishes to how much they would get for the injury? So, or how to the death, so a widow or a soldier would know roughly how much they got?
Well, often the petitions would end by saying to the justices, please consider my case with whatever relief you're at, and you in your wisdoms will see fit, sort of thing. So often that decision's left to the justices on how much to award. In the West Riding of Yorkshire, there was a kind of a system in the 1640s and 50s where I think it was 10 shillings for every child under the age of 7 a war widow had. So widows with lots of young children would get larger pensions. because they had more children. It was deemed that at the age of 7 that the children would be apprenticeable, and would be, the parish officers would have to send them out and find them work as apprentices, and therefore they would only support that extra money to children under 7. But that was just for Yorkshire. I don't know. We need to look carefully at the order books of other counties to see what the justices are ordering. A standard pension, I suppose, the pension most often awarded is usually around about £2 per annum. Now, that's not enough to live on. To keep a family, you'd need about £10 per annum. But £2 or £3 was still a valuable contribution to that, and worth considerable trouble to obtain if you could augment that with other means of income. You weren't supposed to be able to work. That was the point why you were petitioning, that you were incapable of relieving yourself because your injuries prevented you from working. But you might be able to get by with help from friends, with customary rights, with charity, and neighbourly assistance. So in many cases, pensions weren't intended as a whole livelihood, but just a contribution towards one.
We have a question now from Lucas.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, Andrew. The seal that you showed in the presentation has an image of an amputee with a prosthetic leg. Were prosthetic limbs and things like hernia trusses provided by a similar scheme to the pension, or would they be privately purchased by ordinary soldiers?
Very good question. That seal is from the Committee for Maimed Soldiers of the Long Parliament, and it was the image of it was given to us by Eric Gruber von Arnie when he was doing his work on the hospitals in London, and he looked at the hospitals' accounts, and they often were paying money to carpenters to make prosthetics for the patients, and considerable sums. And Eric argued that these prosthetic limbs were really quite sophisticated, and you can compare them with modern ones now that are manufactured today. And although the substances being worked are different, the technology and principles behind them are very similar. So if you were lucky enough to be in one of the hospitals at Savoy or Ely House, you'd have had your prosthetic supplied to you. If you weren't, then some soldiers, once their regiments had moved on and left them behind, they would have had to have been thrown back on their own resources in some cases to pay their surgeons and to pay for whatever help they needed, and then maybe try to claim that back later if they could. But yes, there must have been thousands and thousands of prosthetics, and maimed soldiers were a very visible presence in the decades after the war, and people would have been seen with their crutches and prosthetic legs and so forth. There would have been a very visible presence, especially at the quarter sessions when the soldiers would have been turning up to receive their pensions and having to parade before the justices and show their wounds. There's illustrations of prosthetics in the Battle Scarred exhibition at the National Civil War Centre, and the brochure that we produced for that exhibition is available on our project website. On the About the Project page of the website, you can download and read that, and you'll see some illustrations of 17th century prosthetics compared to modern day ones. We were lent a modern day prosthetic from an Afghanistan war veteran from the British Army today, who kindly lent us his spare one. And we were able to put that in as part of the display to compare the sort of 17th century with 21st century technology, and there's illustrations of that in the brochure on the website.
We have a question from James Gregory on discourses of charity. And there we go, James.
Yeah, can you hear me? So I seem to be constantly banging on about discourses, but I just wondered what the context, in particularly in the Commonwealth era, is in terms of charity. Is there some sense in which charity can be used to heal national divide, live and let die, or is it constantly being politicized? So is there some language of forgiveness, forbearance, and forgetting?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And the big problem with healing and settling, of course, is the slim base of support for the regime and the fear of royalist insurrection. There is a lot of sources that could be looked at for that, but I've not looked at many of them recently, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry, I can't help much with that at the moment. I think that was Cromwell's big problem, wasn't it? He wanted to have healing and settling. He wanted to broaden the base of the regime and to reconcile. But that was very difficult. While royalist soldiers are being denied pensions, the parliamentarian ones are being given them. And it's a tough sell, isn't it?
We've a question from David now.
Right. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Good. It's a rather simple question, really. It's about the way in which assessments are made of the amounts that are to be paid. Is it according to the costs incurred, or is there a sense in which payments are made so that people are not raised above the condition to which they were accustomed, which was a criterion in charity disbursements until very recently in this country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are a number of factors there. The first is the availability of funds. So how much the county treasurers had, that would shape how much they were able to pay out. They had to keep the pension roll quite short, and they would keep trying to weed people out. They would keep trying to declare some people fit for work or disqualify them on some other grounds, perhaps for having supported the wrong side. Severity of the wound would be another factor. How crippled or disabled actually were they? So, for example, soldiers who, there's an example I can of a royalist artilleryman from Hartlepool who's blinded and loses both of his arms. And because he's really clearly a very sad spectacle and utterly unable to help himself, even though he's a royalist, the parliamentarians actually continued his pension. He's the one example I can think of a royalist whose pension, although it's cut from £8 per annum to £3 per annum, they actually still continued his pension. Now, £8 was a large amount for a rank and file soldier, and I think that reflects his awful condition. So there's a sense of those who are wounded more severely and who are more vulnerable and more helpless and dependent would potentially receive more if those funds were available. But also, yes, how much you were awarded would depend too on one's social standing. And if you were an officer or an officer's widow, then the expectation would be that you would get more than if you were a rank and file soldier. And because you would be accustomed to a higher standard of living and would not want to be seen to drop from that or fall from that.
Thank you. Now, just to point out for anybody who's interested, we've put in the chat the details for the link to the website. So I think we've another 2 questions that have come in. So I think we'll take those and then we should probably let you go, Andy. You've been singing for your supper. So the first of these questions is from Jonathan.
Oh, yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. I was just wondering, because some soldiers may have changed sides or have been captured and then fought alongside the people who captured them. Have you found any evidence of soldiers or widows trying to claim pensions from both the parliamentarians and royalists?
Yes, and of course, if they got found out, they could be in trouble. because they could be very easily denounced. And there are examples of that we have found. And also there are quite a number of parliamentarians in 1660 who pulled what we've called the Albemarle manoeuvre. They claimed that they, as they'd been serving under General George Monk, who became the Duke of Albemarle, who helped bring about the Restoration, that they were in fact Charles II's soldiers, and for a time received pensions as if they had been royalists, when of course actually they had been parliamentarians. So it was about how you could spin your story to some degree, how believable it was, and whether the justices or the authorities being petitioned would swallow it and go along with it.
And thanks, that's fascinating. I love the idea of claiming off both sides, double dipping. So we have a question. I think we'll take this as the last question as it's getting on, and we'll take this from Kevin.
Hi, Andy. It's Kevin.
Oh, hi, Kevin.
Do you think that advances in battlefield medicine effectively go hand in hand with periods of conflict? So that soldiers were learning from their experiences in the Civil War, so you saw advances then. But as witnessed in Afghanistan most recently, in that combat medics were saving people's lives on the battlefield, and then the treatment that they received when they got home had advanced so quickly.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, Kevin. Yeah, and I expect there are lots of examples across history of that, where war can often be an accelerant of change, can't it? Sometimes change for the better, sometimes change for the worse. But in this instance, I think you can certainly argue if you read books by Wiseman and Cook, you can see that they were learning from the volume of soldiers they were treating, and basing their treatment on observation and on analysis. And so, yeah, I would go along with that thesis broadly across time. Yeah, that seems a reasonable proposition to me.
Well, thank you very much. I think it now falls on me, as I think that's pretty much all the questions. So thank you for such an engaging talk, a fascinating topic. I think one we'll all look forward to seeing more of. And to everybody for attending this evening, and some absolutely brilliant questions. They've really thrown up lots of questions for me as a Civil War historian, indeed. So we have another talk in 2 weeks' time. The next talk is being run slightly differently, but you'll see details of it advertised. And it just falls on me to say thank you and a big round of applause to our speaker this evening, Professor Andrew Hopper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
And now we've the embarrassing bit where, of course, nobody can clap. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.